What would you recommend for outdoor lighting?
Low budget, the sun, all available, and you can obviously control light to a great extent by, this is a huge subject. We haven't really talked much about shooting exteriors, but there's materials that you can buy low budget wise from Home Depot called Visqueen, which in large sheets it comes in 20-foot rolls, and it'll just take the edge off the harshness of sunshine. Up here in Seattle it isn't so much of a problem, but obviously in LA we have very savage light for many days of the year, and especially during the middle of the day when the sun's almost directly overhead in summer, and so anything you can do to just take the edge off that harshness is great. The trouble is that an awful lot of silks and things that you would want to use, they have a lot of stop loss, so therefore your background suddenly become overexposed. So and obviously you can cheat as you go in. As you get closer, you can cheat more and more, and then use scrims and nets to darken down the background and use a softer material overhead.
Do you recommend using a foam core as a bounce card to sort of fill in the...
that can help quite a lot. I mean, you've got to be careful not to overdo it. I actually use grey material, believe it or not, a lot of the time to overcome those sorts of issues. And that also relates to what we were talking about yesterday or the day before, when being observant about what you're looking at is so terribly important. Like somebody standing on a tennis court is going to be all green under there, so that's another good reason to be thinking about those sorts of techniques as well,
I have a question from Jeff Porter, who says, when using non-standard color temp, low-cost homemade light sources, can you please explain how to determine the color temp settings on the 5D Mark II?
Well, there's a couple of ways of doing it. You can keep your color settings the same and shoot a grayscale with a light of a known color temperature, which would either be a daylight source like a little HMI, or a tungsten source with a full CTO over it if you're looking for a daylight color quality, or a studio light just completely naked, which should be 3200K, and then shoot a still with that same setting, and then you can see the relative difference, and you could even go as far as you can generally, sort of gels are kind of very expensive when you buy them by the roll, but there's lots of people that on eBay, on Craigslist and things like that sell old collections of gels and bits and pieces, and you can pick them up if you're in the filmmaking community. You'll be amazed at what you see in trash cans outside studios and things like that. People throw away large pieces of gel that are actually very usable, and so by using gels to kind of have a look at the difference between the color temperature of this new unknown source relative to something you do know will give you a pretty good clue. Or get a color temperature meter, which is very accurate, and it'll tell you, first of all the color temperature, and also tell you if there's a magenta green shift going on. So that would be the suggestion for that.
Question from Documentary Man. Does Gale use compact fluorescent lights, and what are his thoughts about them in comparison to more traditional lights?
I'm not a great fan of fluorescent light. Sometimes you have no options. I mean, if you go and shoot a scene on any movie in a huge supermarket, unless you're on a huge budget, people don't like you to take the time or have the money to change out all the tubes to, say, color-corrected tubes. So what you often have to do is to go with the lighting that exists. you figure out how much, generally most fluorescents in places like stores or supermarkets, it tends to have quite a large green content in it. So you either read that with a color temperature meter and figure out what that green content is, and then the lighting that you use to supplement that, your own lighting, you add that green component, which could be a 1/4 plus green, an 1/8 plus green, a 1/2 plus green, or something like that, so that then everything becomes more or less the same degree of green content, and then you can correct it overall in post, with your color, or in whichever program you use for doing your color. So I'm not a great fan of fluorescents, and especially not just industrial use fluorescents, because they're first of all, they're not color balanced properly, and secondly, I don't like the non-continuous spectrum that they create. In fact, all fluorescents create sort of a fake spectrum. That helps, hopefully.
Yes. Bernardo would like to know if you can talk about the color rendition index of LED lights compared with regular tungsten lighting.
Actually, I'm glad we brought that up. LED lighting has improved in leaps and bounds just in the last 6 months alone. We don't have it with us here, but we shortly will be on our website sort of releasing a little film with a gentleman called Mike Walsh from City Mills, who's one of our sponsors. They have put a massive amount of research into LED lighting, how to make it work, how to correct the color temperature, how to take out the green content, which was one of the major problems. And it's getting better and better and better, and they even have beautiful light panels that you can vary between, I think it's 2600 K, which is really it's even warmer than studio lighting, right through to almost 6000 K. So it's got a massive range, and it's all done on a dial, so you can use the light for daylight applications, or you can use it for studio lighting applications all in one unit, and they're initially kind of quite expensive. But when you take into account that the bulb, the diode life is something like 60,000 hours or something like that.
It ends up being like 30 years.
It's something like 30 years of use. So if you consider that you don't have to replace bulbs, if you consider that it uses, I don't know what the statistic is, but probably 20 times less power than, say, a tungsten light, and probably half as much power as a fluorescent light for the same given degree of light output, I think the future for LEDs is really here. And weren't you saying that they've started using LED lighting in the streets here in Seattle?
Street lights have been replaced with
Yeah.
LED.
Yeah.
They're also asking about the CRI, the color rendering index, versus fluorescent. And your question before is about compact flat, like the compact fluorescents, what's your color balance do now for daylight? By the time the maintenance here, I'm not going to We're just talking about street lights in Seattle have recently been replaced with these bright LED lights, which are very blue. I know we had them put in front of our house, and it took me like a week or two to get used to it. It was like daylight. Even now, if I walk by a window, it's blue outside. It's like daylight. So I have no idea what the color rendering index is on these, though.
Yeah, I mean, for example, the LEDs that City Mills has been working on have been, they're pretty accurate in terms of really being 3200K and 5600K at the daylight end, and so the LEDs we were showing you for the cheap lighting of car interiors at night, they'll come in any kind of color. Some of them will be magenta, some of them will be green, but the LEDs that are now coming out in the film business are really pretty well made, and a lot of people prior to recent work were sort of overpowering them and actually creating a lot of green content in them. I think that was what it was about. That's what Mike said at one point. So they're getting pretty accurate, and I think we're going to see them more and more just because of in the effort to be green and not consume too much, which is very relevant. We're going to see more and more LED lighting being used all over the place, I think,
How is the throw on the LED lights as far as that goes?
Well, they've now started to, the most recent thing that, say, Cine Mills is working on, and as far as I know, they're one of the most advanced groups that are sort of into R&D on LEDs. They've developed a 650, the equivalent of an LED light source in a 650 watt housing, and they claim that it's going to be the equivalent of a 650 watt light, but at about I don't know what the proportion is, a tenth of the power consumption. So that's a unit with a Fresnel lens on the front, so that will start to be able to throw light, to a distance and work as a conventional lamp. The diode that we saw inside it was about 1.5 inches in diameter, so that would be about the equivalent of a 650 watt globe, more or less. So it should have a fairly similar kind of effect, but the research continues. I mean, the problem with a lot of the LEDs till this point is that there are lots of tiny little light sources, and so people tend to put panels over them and diffuse them and use them as soft lights so they don't throw very far. Just to blend all the, otherwise if you used it very close, you'd have 1,000 nose shadows, for example, which wouldn't be very attractive. But by putting milk plexi or a diffuser over the front, it just turns it into a big kind of soft light. So, but it's all changing. Every day something new is coming along. So I think it certainly will be the future. Whether we'll ever get LEDs that would be equivalent to like an 18K HMI with that kind of firepower, I think we're quite a long way away from that. Or a 20 kilowatt, incandescent fixture. I mean, a 20 kilowatt incandescent fixture, the globe is about this big, and I think they cost about $1,900 for a globe. So when a bulb blows, then there's generally a groan from the production department on house, because that's almost $2,000 down the toilet, and they don't last all that long. They have a certain hour life, and that's the wonderful thing about LEDs is that they theoretically will last for an awfully long time. So, I mean, for example, I think the Cine Mills 2x1 panel, it's about $3,500 now.
Yeah. Something
like that. And but if you take into account over 30 years, the fact that you never had to change a globe, and the fact that you probably used a tenth of the power, it probably makes up for itself, pretty fast.
A follow-up question from Krabby Photo on Twitter. Have you noticed any strobing with LED lighting?
Sorry, any?
Strobing?
Strobing. Actually, no, I haven't. I think but it's a very good question in terms of any low-budget solutions that you go for, in terms of, Home Depot type lighting. Always a very good idea to do a test, to make sure, because there's nothing worse than shooting a scene and then discovering you had a problem with it. So it is possible with cheap fittings. I personally haven't had any problems, but there are several things that look kind of weird with the 5D and 7D and all of those things, like flashes often look really horrible because you just get a strip of bright light across the center of the image, or somewhere in the image, like a quick, so for example, in the film business, we use lights called lightning strikes to simulate sort of lightning when there's a storm going on, and they do not work at all with the HD DSLRs. You just get bands of brightness, and it looks really peculiar, so you can't really use those sorts of lights for that kind of effect on the HD DSLR system, and you probably either need to resort to doing something in After Effects, or using a different kind of camera for that kind of thing, I would say. But strobing, no, I haven't had a problem with it.
Galen, talking about all this budget lighting and ways to save money, Julie and Elle would like to know, what do you think is the most important thing to not be cheap with?
Probably your script writer. After that, your actors. But if seriously, though, talking about technically, I think it's an interesting question. I think, I love incandescent light, so I would never shoot close-ups with fluorescence or. Until I've done a little bit more work with LEDs, I wouldn't use those for close-ups yet. So, but pretty soon I'm prepared to be convinced. But I don't know. You get to love certain things that you work with, and when you see even a.
The crew over here is saying safety, fire extinguishers.
Yeah.
Safety is the thing. Yeah,
actually, very much. That's a very good point. Yeah, it's it's very, some on house, for example, these open-face quartz lights are not very popular with production because it's very easy to cause a fire, especially if they're pointed straight down. The bulbs can explode, and then you get red-hot quartz glass that comes showering down, and there's a danger with all things electric in the end. It's just that obviously if Fresnel has a lens between the bulb and the sort of the scene, and so you have a certain amount of protection. But some lamps, open-face lamps can be very dangerous. A piece of card can be stuck to a wall, and the tape can get hot, and the card can fall down and catch a fire, very easily. And it happens all the time in studios. So we do the best we can. So safety, I suppose, is a very, very good answer to that question.
Safety first, yes. Question from Rich Weston. Do you use daylight balanced bulbs in the China balls? A couple people were asking again, what was it that you used in the China balls?
Sometimes, they make, I can't remember what they're called, but they make bulbs that are kind of blue in color. What do they call those things?
Floods? Compact fluorescents are the new ones. But
yeah, they make actual blue incandescent globes, though.
photo floods.
Yeah. So not very often would be the answer to that. We often wrap China balls in gel for different colored effects, especially if they're small. Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's like the 150 or 100 watt.
Wow.
This is a 105, it comes out to about 300 to 400 watts.
Wow.
To balance.
Well, that's absolutely huge. Are these pretty accurate?
Relatively.
Yeah. Wow.
They're pretty close.
Yeah. What would you say was the equivalent light output from a,
It's 350 to maybe 400 watts.
Yeah. So, well, I've never. Wow, that's very cool.
Yeah, it is a mobile base. No, actually, it's a standard.
Very cool. Yeah, so as we see that, I've never seen one of those before, so it's changing every day, and that's really interesting. Cool. So I think a few more questions, and then I'm going to go to the other end of the scale and talk about a lighting problem I had to solve recently, which is equivalent, not quite as insane, but equivalent to the Earth to the Moon story from yesterday. But so we have any more questions about sort of lowest budget lighting or?
There's quite a few more questions. We're looking forward to your story, though. We have a question from Joe Sinkovich, who wanted to know how much continuous light in watts does it take to overpower the sun outdoors? I don't know if we covered that already.
Actually, I really don't know. I sort of, the story I'm about to tell is that I needed to light an interior to about a stop brighter than sunlight inside. So it's funny, I've never really kind of thought about the sun in terms of being a light with a given power attached to it. It depends very much on time of day. It varies so much from time of day and where you are, how close to the equator you are, and so on and so forth. I mean, there's obviously places where the I shot in one part of Canada once where in the middle of the day the sun was at 11 degrees. It never ever got more than 11 degrees above the horizon, so it varies enormously. But that's a very difficult question to answer. Would you guys have an answer to that?
Generally speaking, I'd say that's probably one of the areas where DSLRs, a lot of people say you can work with less light. Once you're competing with sunlight, that's where you still need the truck.
Yeah.
You know, because the sun is a pretty constant source. A lot of times you can have a 12K, or not a 12K, but a 1200 HMI, and you know, you're 10 feet away going through a little bit of diffusion, and you're barely getting a key on somebody, you know, who's backlit or side lit from the sun. So you still need a lot of wattage when you have to compete.
Right. But you can use, obviously, we all use reflectors quite a lot, because very often when you're working sunny exteriors, reflectors can actually do a lot more than lighting. You know, if you use shiny boards, which are kind of like slightly dullish mirrors, and put them through diffusion, you can often get more light from those than you can from an 18K HMI. So all depends on circumstance and throw distance and all kinds of factors like that, you know.
Question from the chat room. If you had budget for only one expensive light, do you have a recommendation?
I'd probably take the biggest light I could get. It would probably be a 24K incandescent light, because it's easy to throw light away, but when you're short of it, you really know it. So I'd just take one great big Fresnel lamp. Actually, I tell a lie. My favorite light of all time would be a carbon arc brute. So I'd take one of those.